me ask you sort of a silly question to start with this morning, but if you were living in the first century in Jesus' time and you wanted to hear the latest news, or you wanted to hear a big idea that you could think about or discuss with people, or if you wanted to see the latest celebrity and you didn't have a TV in the first century, where would you go? What would you do? How would you come about across those ideas? What might you do if that's what you were going to do? Think about that for a second. Where do you find big ideas? Where do you find news? Where do you hear celebrities? What do you do? Second question is this. If you're a poor person and you've exhausted all your resources and you don't have anything left, and you don't know what to do, and there's no social programs around, there's nothing to support you, your family cannot support you, and you need help, where do you go? What do you do? What is the place you go to find some assistance or at least a little bit of scrap of food so you can survive for the next day? Oddly, the answer to those two questions is exactly the same. If you live in Jesus' day and you want to hear the biggest ideas around, if you want to hear the latest news, if you want to hear stories from other lands, or if you are poor and sick and needy, the place you go is to one of the prominent members of the town's home. What would happen is that when somebody famous came into town, one of the prominent members of the town would invite him over for supper, and they would host this supper out in an outdoor courtyard similar to this. Most of the buildings in Jerusalem and in the Holy Land at the time were built like this, with courtyards in the middle. Little rooms on the side where you prepare your food or where you would sleep, but most people kind of lived out in the courtyard because it's so warm. So you have an open air courtyard, and what would happen often is that the most prominent person in town would invite a guest over to his house. And they would set up the tables out in this courtyard, and then he would also invite anyone else in the town who wanted to come. And everyone else in the town who wanted to come would hang out in the areas around the courtyard, and they would then be able to hear the prominent guest talk about his big ideas. Or he would hear the prominent guest talk about far-flung adventures in other towns. Or he would hear ideas that he'd never heard before. Or you would be able to be part of this community by just coming and listening to the supper talk. Conversely, if you were poor and had very little, what you would also do is wait for one of these great big suppers, and you would go to it as well, because at the end of the supper, when everyone was done, the scraps from the table would be given to the poor in attendance. And so they would go away with something that would keep them going for a couple of days. So this was a really common practice that a prominent person in town, when somebody famous came to town, would host a great big dinner, invite people to come and listen, and it would be held out in a very public sort of place like that. This is the picture that's happening in Luke chapter 7 with Jesus. Jesus is the prominent teacher that has come to town. People have known about Jesus for a while. He's been teaching and preaching, and people have been talking about how he's been healing people. And so one of the prominent members of town, his name is Simon, decides that he will host a supper. And Simon hosts this supper in his courtyard at his house, and there's lots of people gathered around. Simon, as I said, is considered one of the great people in town. He's one of the prominent people. He's a Pharisee. Simon is one of the best people anyone knows. He is the best man anyone knows. He does the right things. He says the right things. He thinks the right things. He is the rightest person around. However, on this night, Simon is going to find out that he has two things going on in his life that no one else would have seen that are actually holding him back from Jesus. Two things going on in his life that are not promoting spiritual health, but actually keeping him from spiritual health. And no one else sees it because everyone else has the exact same issues. And I don't think sometimes we've seen it as we've read Scripture, because we might have the same problems as well. Two barriers that keeps Simon from being who he ought to have been? Luke chapter 7 is where we will find it. Luke chapter 7 verse 36 says this. Now one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, and so he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. When a woman who had lived a sinful life in that town learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster jar of perfume. And as she stood behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured the perfume on them. Let me just add a few more details for you. When you went to these dinners, the table that you sat at was not how we do it, not a great big table you sat on chairs with your feet underneath. What they would do is they had a very low table, and they would recline on their left hand with their feet out behind them. And so this woman who's standing in the courtyard and hears that Jesus is around, comes to this place, finds Jesus at this table, and then she starts crying. And she starts crying and crying, and she goes over to Jesus and she starts crying so much her tears are falling on his feet. And so she unbinds her hair. Her hair has been bound up in a bun or a ball or in a turban of some sort, and she unbinds her hair. Can you believe that? Doesn't mean anything to us, but in those days when she unbinds her hair, that is inappropriate. That is as inappropriate as wearing a bathrobe to a banquet. Like, it is not done. You do not do this. When a woman gets married, she binds her hair up, and she is never seen with her hair down again in those times. But in this moment, her tears falling on Jesus' feet, she needs to wipe them off somehow, and she unbinds her hair. It would have been shocking at the moment. And it is shocking. In fact, Simon is shocked. So it says, verse 39, when the Pharisee who invited him saw this woman with this reputation, by the way, did you see how Luke described her? He said, a woman who had lived a sinful life in the town. Anyone want to guess what her sinful life was? She's likely a prostitute, is likely what he's saying. When the Pharisee who invited him saw this, he said to himself, you know, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is. She is a sinner. Now notice that Simon says this to himself. This is his inner dialogue. This isn't something he says to everyone. This is just what he thinks. He thinks to himself, I might have misjudged this whole thing. Because if Jesus really was who he claimed to be, he'd be much smarter about this. And he would know who this woman was. And he would know who is touching him. And he'd be as revolted as I am. But he's not. So he must be wrong. Verse 40, Jesus turns to him and says, Simon, I have something to tell you. Well, tell me, teacher, he says. You don't see this in the Greek or in the English, but the Greek scholars I read said that his answer here in the Greek is sort of like, well, I don't care what he got to tell. It's not really eager. He doesn't really want to hear what Jesus has to say. He just says, whatever. Tell me something then. And Jesus said to him, 2 men owed a certain moneylender money. One owed him 500 denarii, the other 50. Neither had the money to pay him back, so he canceled the debts of both. Now, which one of them will love him more? And Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt canceled. You've judged correctly, Jesus said. We'll pick up the rest of the story here in a second, but the first thing I want you to notice and the first thing I want you to think about is this. What is Simon's problem? What is going on here? What is the issue that we need to see, and what do we need to make sure we're correcting in ourselves? And number one, I want to show you that that Simon let the poor in, but he did not really welcome them. First barrier in Simon's life is that he let the poor into his house. That was what he was expected to do. He let that woman come in, but he didn't welcome her. Right? You heard his thinking. You heard his thoughts. You heard how he looked at her, right? He looked across his little courtyard and he said, what is she doing here? And what is she doing touching him? And what is she doing unbinding her hair? And why is this woman doing these things in this moment? And if Jesus knew who was touching her, he wouldn't let her do that. And you can hear Simon thinking, Simon thinks he's better than her. Right? Simon thinks he's better than her. Simon thinks he's in a different category than her. Simon has just decided that he can look down his nose at this woman. What Simon doesn't realize is that Simon is a sinner just like her. In fact, Simon's pride is probably as much of a sin as hers. In fact, maybe a worse sin than hers. Just that her sin is much more visible than his. Everyone knows her sins. People don't really know Simon's. But Simon has a barrier up here that says this woman, while she is welcome in this place, isn't really welcome in this place. Right? He's let her into his house, but he doesn't really like her. He doesn't really care about her. He doesn't really want her there. He doesn't really want her benefits. He'd be happier if she just didn't show up. Now, I said to you at the start that we need to think about these things because I think this still happens all the time. I think it kind of happens in churches sometimes. I think it kind of happens in our own minds sometimes. And I think lots of times we put up barriers to people. We say, God loves everyone and everyone's welcome and anyone can come to church. And yet we sort of have our own little rules and our own expectations and our own sort of thoughts about what churchy people ought to look like. Right? Anyone can come in, but we're kind of happier if they kind of act like us and look like us and dress like us and think like us. Right? We're kind of happier if we don't have to deal with people's issues. We're kind of happier if they come in and just fit in rather than come in and don't fit in at all. Right? We kind of like it better. Because we like to say that everyone's welcome, but it's not always true. And it's easy for us sometimes to look at people and not really love them as we ought to. At least it is for me. It's easy for us to sort of look at people and sort of think, well, you don't really belong here. You know? Have you ever felt that? Have you ever seen that? Have you ever seen that happen anywhere? Not even just in churches, but have you felt that before? That you don't really belong? Because if you've ever felt it, you feel it obviously. It is obvious when people think that way. When Sarah and I first got married, we were on our honeymoon. We were going over towards Yellowstone National Park. We'd been driving all day long. We ended up in Bismarck, North Dakota. In the days before cell phones and the days before thinking ahead very much, we get to Bismarck late at night and we didn't have a hotel reservation anywhere. We didn't know where we were going. We didn't even have a map of Bismarck. We'd never been to Bismarck before. Getting late at night, we decided that maybe we ought to go find a place to stay. And so we find the first hotel we can find and we go there. Go inside and ask if they have a room. Yep, how much is it? It's a lot. Like it was a lot of money. But we're on our honeymoon, who cares? So we pay the bill and go out to the car to get our stuff. And when we come back in with our suitcases, we're kids, right? Like we're mid-20s. And we've been driving all day. We're in shorts and t-shirts and whatever. And we're dragging our stuff through this hotel. And this hotel, like I said, it was fairly expensive. But it seems like it was a place where businessmen hung out. Because there are all kinds of people in suits sitting in the front lobby reading newspapers and talking to each other about the markets. That's how I remember it anyway. You can ask Sarah. But what I remember is people kind of looking at us like, you know, what are they doing here? Now, we paid the bill. We were allowed to be there, but it was obvious people were kind of going, they know where they're supposed to be. Are they supposed to be here? Who let them in? I don't know if you've ever felt that, but if you've ever felt it once, you know it very well, because it's obvious. And that's the way Simon's dealing with this woman. He's kind of looking at her and saying, I don't know why she's here. And he wishes she wasn't. And I think the danger is that we start making rules to kind of keep people out or make them feel uncomfortable so they don't come back. It's easy to make up rules just to keep people away. And I don't think we intentionally do that. I don't think it's something we would say, oh yeah, that's what we want to do. I don't think Simon would have said that, but it's the way his heart is. His heart is thinking, you shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be touching him. You shouldn't be involved. You're not our kind of people. And the danger is that we start making rules. We start making situations that just don't make sense. And when that happens, it becomes obvious too. Jesus sees this and says, Simon, you've got a problem here. You've got a problem, Simon, and that's going to be the second part of our story. But the Pharisees loved this sort of thing, though. The Pharisees had all these rules. The Pharisees had all these things that you had to jump through to make yourself acceptable, right? I mentioned this in Bible study. If you're taking notes, you'll find this in Matthew 23, verse 4. But Jesus said, the Pharisees, you've got to listen to them because they teach the right things. But in Matthew 23, verse 4, he says, but they bind up loads on people and make them carry them, and they will not lift a finger to help them. That's metaphorical. They make you jump through a bunch of hoops. They make you do certain things. They make you act in certain ways, and they don't want to help you do it at all. They've just made up rules to make up rules. And if you make up rules to make up rules, eventually people see how stupid those rules are, and then they don't want to be part of them. I asked Megan if I could tell this story. Last summer, we ended up going to a Rough Rider game. I ended up going with Scott Wade from Weyburn. Sarah and Megan got tickets from Kendall. He'd won some tickets at work, and so they ended up going to the same football game. But they ended up sitting in a different part of the stadium. When we went to the game, we knew that you could only bring certain things into the stadium, and so we looked at different rules they had and whatever, and thought we were okay, so we took off. And on the way to the football game, Megan bought a purse in Weyburn, I think it was. Little tiny purse like this. Leather purse. When she got to the football stadium, they looked at her little tiny purse and said, you can't bring that in. And she said, well, why? And they said, well, it's too big. You can't bring that in. You've got to be in a see-through bag. You've got to have blah, blah, blah. So she said, well, what am I going to do? Because I've got this thing, and I've got my purse. I'm not going back 2 miles to the vehicle. I'm not leaving my vehicle in the purse. What can I do? They said, well, you can do this. If you go over to the Ryder store over here and buy a $10 plastic bag, you can put your purse in the plastic bag, and then you can go into the stadium. So that's what she had to do. She couldn't take her purse into the stadium, but if she put it in a plastic bag, then they let her go in. That's how silly things start getting, right? When we start making rules just to make rules make sense, I guess. And sometimes churches act that way too. And here's Simon doing the same sort of thing. Simon's thinking, you're welcome here, but if you jump through all these things. Simon let her in the house, but he wasn't really welcoming her, right? And I guess my first point is simply this. It is not our job to keep people out. It is our job to welcome. And we need to realize that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, Romans 3:23, and that we're all forgiven and saved through Christ, which is the 24th verse. And we need to make sure we're not putting up barriers that don't need to exist. Simon welcomed that woman in, but he didn't really welcome her in. Second problem with Simon is this, is that Simon was too focused on the cost. Simon was too focused on what he was having to give to be a follower rather than the blessing of discipleship. That's the second issue that Jesus addresses with him. And he addresses it there by saying, we've already read part of it, but he says, I want to tell you a story. He says, there's this guy who owned 500 denarii, which is just the money of the day, or one who owed 50. And the money lender who loaned them both to that money forgave both debts. Who do you think was happier about that? He said, well, obviously the guy who was forgiven the most. And Jesus' point is here, you know what? He said, you've judged correctly. That if you realized how much you'd been forgiven, you wouldn't care how much else you had to do. Right? Listen to Simon's attitude here as Jesus describes it, though, and we'll talk about this for a second. Verse 44, he says, he turned toward this woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house and you did not give me any water for my feet. People wore sandals, roads were dirty. You would have someone, usually a slave in the home, wash people's feet. So you didn't do that. But she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You didn't give me a kiss, but this woman from the first time I entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You didn't put oil on my head, another custom that was just to cool you off and keep you smelling nice. But she's poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, for she has loved much, but he who's been forgiven little loves little. He says to Simon, you know what? When I first walked in here, you didn't do anything for me. In fact, you were thinking about the least you could do for me. You didn't wash my feet. You didn't put oil on my head. You didn't give me a welcoming kiss, another thing that was very common to do. He said you did the very least you could do. And he said it's a sign of a problem when all you can think about is what is the least I can do. Because that means you don't actually love. Because love doesn't think in terms of what is the least I can do. Love thinks extravagantly. Love thinks in terms of what is the best I can do for this person. What is the biggest thing I can do? What is the most I can do? He says, Simon, you've got a problem because you're thinking only about the least. In another incident that looks very much like this one, in the last week of Jesus' life, another woman comes and breaks a vial of perfume and pours it on his feet to prepare him pours it on his head, prepares him for his burial. At that time, everybody was mad because she took this vial of perfume that she had. A lot of the Jewish ladies would wear a vial of perfume around their neck. It was one of the things that was given to them when they were married. And they wore it as a symbol almost. Broken open only on special occasions, only when something wonderful was happening. In the other incident, when the woman breaks the vial, everybody says, well, what are you doing? That was worth a year's wages. Everybody's costing how much it cost, right? Everybody's thinking, what is that costing her? And again, in that incident, Jesus says, if you're thinking about the cost, you've missed the point. And again, that's the barrier here that Simon is up against. He's thinking about the cost rather than the benefit. He's thinking about what he's going to lose rather than what he's gaining. He's thinking about what this is the least I can do rather than what is the most and what is the best. And I think that is an interesting gauge to put against ourselves and say, when I think about serving, when I think about church, when I think about God, when I think about helping others, am I looking to do the least or the most? Am I looking to be generous, or am I looking just for the smallest little bit I can get away with? Because I think that tells us something about our hearts. Jesus says to Simon, this woman gets it. Because she's being extravagant. She's being generous. She's just trusting me with everything. You don't get it. Because you are being calculating and cold and counting the cost of what this is costing you. Love is extravagant. My favorite illustration of this, and I've used it a few times, but I love this illustration, but it's bigger than just us, it's you guys, is that my favorite Christmas present from Sarah ever was one Christmas morning I opened this package, and she'd given me a garage door opener, even though we didn't have a garage. Right? She knew I wanted a garage, we couldn't afford to build one, but she bought me a garage door opener and said, let's build a garage. And it was crazy because we didn't have money to do that. We didn't have extra money, at least anyway. But she said, I know you want this, so let's build a garage. And that sort of thinking is the thinking of love that says, I don't know how we'll do this or what this is going to look like. We don't have a lot of money, but let's go do something that you would love. Love thinks extravagantly. Well, when it came time to build that garage, a bunch of you came to help pour the cement pad and shovel cement around. And you didn't have to do that, but you did it for me. Why? Because you loved me. You cared about me. You wanted to help. And love doesn't think about what's the least I can do. Love thinks, if Tim needs help, I'm going to go help him. So you did that. And several of you came and helped frame that thing. And you did that not because you were getting paid, but because you thought, gee, Tim and Sarah could use some help, and I love them, so I'm going to go help them. And you helped extravagantly. Bob Good spent hours and hours over there sheeting things and putting roofs back on the thing. And Jeff came and helped wire, and all kinds of people. I don't even want to list everybody. John and Margaret came and helped to shingle it. People stepped up and said, how can we help you? Because love doesn't think about what is the least we can do. Love says, what can we do? What is the best we can do? What is the most I can give? What do you need? That's how love thinks. And Simon's not thinking in terms of love. Simon is thinking in terms of cost. So Jesus says, you know what? You're missing the point. This woman actually gets it. This woman is actually in the right spot because she understands. She understands that no matter what she gives, even if she gives this vial of perfume that costs a year's worth of wages, what she's been given by me by having her sins forgiven is worth a lot more than that. It's worth more than anything she gives back. You might remember that Jesus, another time, he was in the temple with his disciples. Again, taking notes if you want to write it down. Luke 21, verses 1 through 4. They're sitting in the temple area. This old woman comes in. She's got 2 little coins. That's all she's got. She puts them in the collection plate. Jesus looks at her and says, that woman there just gave more than anyone. More than every rich person here. Why? Because she gave of what she had. She gave the last of what she had. And most of the people would look at that and say, well, that's ridiculous. And Jesus looks at her and says, that's beautiful. Because you're being extravagant. And you're trusting me. And you're believing that I'm looking after you. There's something about being extravagant, not holding back and counting the cost all the time. That is the difference between really understanding and not understanding at all. Jesus said in another place, oh, I like this quote, by the way. If one first gives himself to the Lord, all other giving is easy. I think that's the idea we're talking about here. If you've actually understood that God is the one who saved you, if you've actually given your life to him, then anything else you're asked to give isn't that hard. But if you think you're still in charge and everything is mine, if I have to give something now, I've got to calculate it. And I'm mad to give it because it's mine. If I've given myself to God and understand nothing is mine, then take what you want, right? Jesus said this in another place, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field which a man found and then covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has to buy the field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who on finding one pearl of great value went and sold all that he had and bought it. The kingdom of heaven is worth everything we've got. And if we're holding stuff back and saying, well, I don't want to do that, then we don't really understand the kingdom we found. And I think that's Simon's problem in this story too. Jesus said, you haven't done anything for me. This woman has done everything because she understands and you do not. So what do we get to the so what here? Every sermon's got to have a so what. What am I trying to say to you? What are we needing to think about as we go from here? What do we need to understand? I told you at the start that Simon was the nicest guy in town. Simon was a Pharisee. He was the rightest guy in town. If you asked anyone to just look at him, he would have been the guy they thought was the closest to God. But he had some problems. I was reading the other day about aircraft and about how they inspect airliners. And they were talking about airframe fatigue. How when you fly an airplane long enough, because it flexes so much, that eventually the welds start to crack and the metal starts to crack. And they're not cracks you can see visibly, but if you examine them very closely, you can see all these little fine cracks. And all kinds of airliners are taken out of service every year, not because they look bad, but because they actually have these little fine cracks that nobody can see. And it's really, really dangerous. And I think that's what's happened to Simon here. If you just looked at him closely, or on a first glance, you would think he's great. He's a great guy. Look at what he does. But he had some little fine cracks in him that he needed to fix. He had some little fine flaws that he needed to get past. He didn't really love people, and he didn't really love God. In fact, those aren't really small things. Those are huge things. But those are things that he had hidden amongst them. he needed to see. I think we need to apply this story to us because it's easy for us to kind of go through the motions and say, well, yeah, but sort of in my heart, not really love people. Sort of look down my nose at them. It's easy for me to do that. It's easy to think I'm better than other people when really, I might just be better at hiding things. And it's easy for me to sort of think in terms of what's the least I can do. What's required rather than actually loving God and saying, I'm here to do anything. We need to switch those attitudes. We need to make sure we have the right ones so that we're living with the right expression of who we are. Not because that happened in this story, not because I'm telling you to, but because this is actually Jesus' example. Jesus' example is to look at people and say, I love you enough to die for you. Jesus actually cared about others, and Jesus gave everything, right? That is the message of this verse. John 3:16 says, For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. We are not here to condemn the world. We are here to love them. We are not here to hold back. We are here to give. That is our goal. That is our hope. That is who we're supposed to be. And that is who God's called us to be, because that will make us like his Son. If you have your communion stuff today, we will do that right now. As I say, I think the cross is the biggest example, the greatest example of the attitudes we ought to have. That God loved us, not because we were perfect, not because we jumped through all the hoops, not because we had all the rules figured out. God just looked at us and loved us. In that passage we just read, I love the line where Jesus turns to Simon and says, do you see this woman? Because Simon really had never seen her. He saw her as he wanted to see her, as that sinner. But Jesus says, have you seen her? Do you know who she really is? Do you actually care? When Jesus looks at us, he looks past our sinfulness and sees who we are as his children. And that's the attitude we ought to emulate and model as well. Every week we're reminded that we need forgiveness. And then we get to pass that forgiveness on. So let's remember that this morning. Father, thank you for the blessing of your Son. Thank you for his body on the cross. Thank you for the forgiveness you offer us. Thank you, Lord, that this forgiveness is not based on our goodness, but on yours. It's not based on our righteousness, but it's on yours. Father, thank you that you saw us differently, that you saw who we really are rather than the trouble we are in. Father, thank you for the rescue from the trouble. Thank you for your Son and the cross. Thank you for hope. Help us to live in that hope and then pass that hope to others as well. In your Son's name, amen. Father, thank you for the blood of Jesus. Thank you that he gave his life for ours. Thank you that through his death we find new hope and new life. Not just here, but eternally as well. Thank you for his resurrection. Thank you that we get to look forward to resurrection and new life as well. Father, help us to live in new attitudes this week. Help us not to just talk about these things, but help us to live this new life. Help us to see people with new eyes, hear people with new ears, have new hearts to each other. Father, help us to be not only reminded today, but help us to be guided by the blood of Christ. In your Son's name, amen. For those watching the video today, as always, thank you for doing so. If you're able to join us in person, we'd sure like to see you. Thanks again.